Welcome to Paper Defiance, which is usually a fortnightly podcast all about indie bookshops and their owners. My name's Alex, and I'm recording this on Wadawurrung land in Ballarat, Australia. It's exciting to have you join me. This is a break in my fortnightly schedule to bring you a slightly different episode. It's still an interview, but this time it's not with a bookshop owner, but more someone adjacent to that land. Garth Nix is an author whose books I've loved for a very long time. His most recent series starts with The Left-Handed Booksellers of London and will continue with The Sinister Booksellers of Bath, which hopefully gives you an idea for why I asked him to be on the podcast. He also started his working life in a bookshop and has had various other book-connected roles in the following decades, all of which make this interview fit really nicely into the Paper Defiance niche, as I hope you'll agree.
Hello, I'm Garth Nix. I'm the author of many books over many years, including the Old Kingdom series that begins with Sabriel, the Keys to the Kingdom series that begins with Mr. Monday, and many others. Most recently, Tertial and Eleanor, which is the sixth book in the Old Kingdom series, and just before that, The Left-Handed Booksellers of London. And my next book coming up is The Sinister Booksellers of Bath, which continues in the Left-Handed Booksellers universe, as it were.
Fantastic. I'll get to those latest books in a moment. But I wanted to start, Garth, by taking you back to when you weren't yet a full-time author. And I know that you spent some time in the book-selling world. Can you tell me a little bit about that and how you got into it?
Sure. Well, I've had many different jobs in the book industry over the years. My first one was as a bookseller. I mean, going way back, it started when I was 19, and I decided that I did want to become a writer. And I'd read enough. I mean, I love writers' biographies. I love reading about the industry and so on. And I'd read enough to realise that I would need a good day job because it's very hard to make a living, and so much of it relies on luck, basically. I have been very fortunate, but I'm actually kind of astonished that I was sensible enough that at 19 I was thinking, okay, I do want to be a writer, but I've got a plan for a day job, and I need a degree to have a better day job. So I better go to university and get a degree so I can get a better day job. And as it happened, when I decided that, I was actually traveling in the United Kingdom and Europe, and I was writing, and I went back and I thought, I've got to get a degree. What can I do? And I just discovered that there was a writing degree. And at that time, there was really only, I think, two in the whole of Australia. And this one was at what is now the University of Canberra, but back then it was the Canberra CAE. And I lived in Canberra. My parents lived in Canberra. I'd gone back to stay with them. So I thought, I'll do a writing degree. That sounds perfect. And over the course of that degree, that really just sort of confirmed the knowledge that I would need, good day jobs, or interesting ones at least, that would pay enough to sustain life while I kept writing. And I had some paid writing gigs through my writing degree. I was very lucky there as well. But it was still very hard, and I sold a couple of stories and things. And towards the end of my degree, some friends of mine were working at Dalton's bookshop in Canberra, the big old Dalton's doesn't exist anymore. It was in the middle of the city. It was by far the biggest bookshop. It was the best known. It was a real, it was a real establishment. And they said, do you want to come and work with us? And so I went and was interviewed by the very stern Margaret Dalton, who frightened me rather, but she did offer me a job. And so I worked as a bookseller immediately after leaving university. So I was writing, and I was learning to be a bookseller, and I learnt a great deal about books and about what people read and how they choose books just from being in the bookshop. And I think it's a tremendous apprenticeship, both for working in publishing, as I did later, but also for writers. I think it's a very valuable thing to work in a bookshop. And as it turned out, I probably would have stayed there for much longer, but the Daltons decided to retire and sell the bookshop, actually sell the building. They had the secret of success in book selling, which is to own the real estate. It's really the only way, and it's a very low margin business, but if you own the real estate, anything can happen. So unfortunately, as I thought at the time, I thought, oh, that's a shame. I would have stayed longer. I was there for about 8 months. But in the last few months, I was looking for a new job, and I was talking to one of the sales reps from a small publisher who used to come in, and she offered me a job in Sydney as a sales rep and as a publicist, which is a very strange combination of roles. It's very hard to do, but that's what I moved on to next. And that was my first non-book selling job. But, a sales rep, very closely connected, because, of course, you're visiting bookshops trying to sell them stuff. I mean, it's all different degrees of trying to sell things to people. And from there, I eventually became an editorial assistant, and I worked my way up and to being a senior editor at HarperCollins eventually. And then I left for a while. I got tired of being poor, basically, because publishing jobs are badly paid. I'd had one book published at that stage, but I hadn't, which was The Rag Witch, which is when I was a senior editor at HarperCollins. Was when that came out. I'd actually sold it before I was there to Pam Macmillan. But I was tired I went traveling, I came back and I thought, what can I do instead? I love books, I love publishing, but I'd like to just earn some money. And so I went to work in marketing and PR, where I was still using my writing skills for tech companies, basically, but it was massively, massively better paid. But then that sort of coincided with my writing career taking off, and eventually I had to sort of decide what to do. This is condensing a more complicated story, perhaps. So I had the opportunity where I could be a full-time writer. I had an American deal, which meant I could live for a few years. So I decided, okay, and by that stage I was a partner in my own PR business, and I disappointed my partners greatly by deciding that I would exit at that point, and I became a full-time writer. But actually I wasn't prepared mentally for that. It was interesting because I'd always been incredibly busy working, both publishing jobs and then later the PR marketing job, and writing at night and just on Sunday afternoons. So when I became a full-time writer, I actually did very little for quite a long time because I hadn't psychologically prepared myself I just kept thinking, I'm a full-time writer. I can do it tomorrow. I've got all this time. And then sort of 9 months into that year of doing very little, I had a complete freak out because I had a book due and so on. And at the same time, I had the opportunity, I was helping out Curtis Brown Australia with the acquisition of the Hickson agency. And Fiona Inglis is an old friend of mine. We've been editors together at HarperCollins. She said, well, why don't you come and be an agent part-time, and you can be a writer and an agent. And I did that. And so I went back, and that was my last publishing job. I was an agent with Curtis Brown, which I loved. I mean, and in a way, the book selling and the agenting are two ends of the spectrum, or they're at each end of a very important spectrum, but you're basically trying to match people with books. I mean, as an agent, you're finding stuff and then you're matching it with an editor to buy it. As a bookseller, you're trying to match a customer with a book and so on. Those were probably my favorite jobs in the book industry. But ultimately, I had to stop being an agent because I couldn't balance not so much the writing. I could have continued to be a writer and an agent if it was only just the writing. But of course, it's not. It's also all the promotional stuff, and I couldn't say to my clients, I'm sorry, I can't read your manuscript. I can't do anything. I'm going on tour in the US and the UK for my book for the next month. No, that just doesn't work. Yeah, and it's just not compatible, unfortunately. Some people seem to manage it, but I think the only way to manage it would be to not do that sort of promotional stuff, or less of it or something. And so I had to make that choice. But so I had many different jobs in books, and I love books. I love the book industry. I wish I could do more things. I mean, if I could open a bookshop tomorrow, I would. I can't afford to lose that much money, but
Yeah, I was going to say opening a bookshop seems a lot like the joke about the wine industry. How do you
Yes.
make a small
Start with a large
fortune?
one.
Start with a big one. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, a friend of mine and I worked. We worked out quite a decent plan, but it's such a small margin industry that the plan really has to be that you make your money some other way, which supports the selling of the books, hence cafes and so on, because the margin on coffee is so much better than it is on books, and so on. Maybe. I love seeing authors who do have bookshops, but typically, they are supporting something which, at best will be break even or maybe very small profit, but with so much work, so much work is needed just to reach that point, and it becomes, all embracing, I think. So I quite like the idea of a sort of hobby bookshop but I'd have to support it with money because I couldn't support it with time and energy, or not enough. And yes, it's certainly not a recipe to make your fortune, that's for sure.
Books and kind of the consumption of books and so on feature in a lot of your books that I've read, as far as I can tell. And as you said earlier, most prominently, I guess, in your most recent, I want to say series, is there going to be one after the Bath book, or is that a secret?
After the Sinister Booksellers of Bath? Oh, there might be. I suspect it may well be a series. Yeah. At the moment, it's 2.
Okay.
But it may well... I'm never quite sure about these things. Unless it's something like The Keys to the Kingdom,
yep.
which was very definitely planned as a series due to the structure of the narrative. Though even then, I tried to make it not 7 books.
Horrible thought.
Well, how do you do a days of the week series? It's kind of like you do Monday to Friday and then the weekend or something. But I didn't want to do 7, but I couldn't make the structure of the story I wanted to tell work except in that way. So,
yeah. On my behalf, at least, I say thank you for the 7, because I liked all 7 of them.
Oh, thank you. Well, that was the story.
Yeah, absolutely. So then, from my perspective, the obvious question is, how do you come to the idea of booksellers being these kind of protectors and defenders of magic? Actually, how are you describing the booksellers in your books? How are you doing that?
Well, the left and the right-handed booksellers of the left-handed booksellers of London and the Sinister Booksellers of Bath are part of an ancient clan, I guess, whose job it is to keep the ancient mythic powers of England essentially under control, and make sure they don't impinge too much on the modern world. And they're booksellers, for sort of a variety of reasons, but one of them is that what they do is such a stressful. One of them is actually that is how they make their money and sustain their operations to a degree. But the other one is that it's also a sort of an anti-stress mechanism for them. Reading and books are really important to them as a means of de-stressing from the awful things that they are often involved in, and the very stressful and dangerous things, which seems to me to make sense. And also the nature of bookshops as repositories of knowledge and secrets. I think, they totally go together. So the notion of booksellers who are, protectors and sort of, who protect and police these ancient secrets, I think it just seems to make perfect sense to me. I didn't overly think about it. I didn't really think very much about it when I started. I said, yeah, that makes sense. Of course, bookshops are magic. Booksellers are magic too. Why not? Yeah.
Yep. Have you come across people in bookshops who are, kind of wave their left hand at you? And
I've had various booksellers, say don't reveal too much.
Yeah.
And so on. But the basic idea came from, from a book. I was in a bookshop in Leith, in the port part of Edinburgh, and I was signing Golden Hand, one of the Old Kingdom books, with my gold Sharpie, which the publicist carried about 10 of them. Because weirdly, the metallic Sharpies, they don't last as long as the other ones. You can only do like 50 signatures and you need a new one. And the black ones will do 500 or 1,000 or whatever. So that's an important bit of knowledge there. Metallic Sharpies, not as much, don't last as long. And the bookseller who was helping me open the books and so on, I noticed he was left-handed. And I possibly was left-handed. I'm of an age where I wasn't allowed to be, at school, and I can write with my left hand as well as my right. And my older son's left-handed, and so I'm sort of interested in left-handedness anyway. So I said to him, you're left-handed. And he said, yes, we all are. So all the booksellers in this bookstore in Leith. And I said, oh, you're the left-handed booksellers of Leith. And he said, yeah, I guess we are. And I thought, there's a story. There's a story in that. And yeah, I made some notes that day about the left-handed booksellers of Leith. And I immediately thought, well, they just sound interesting. So I'm sure they're up to something. What are they up to? Who are these left-handed booksellers? But I changed it to London, partly because I know London. I mean, I've actually visited Leith quite often, but I know London much better. And also it's a much bigger scope, of course. So it just seemed to make more sense. And then in the course of working it out, I also decided to set it back in 1983, which is when I first went to the United Kingdom, and I spent quite a lot of time in London and other parts. And that was also kind of instinctive. I don't actually know why, but I liked it. It gave me, it's like a lot of things I do in my writing. I don't really know why, but if I like them, then I think other people probably will too. Doesn't always work, but my particular things that I particularly like in stories aren't always universal, but it mostly works. So if I make myself happy with the story, I think it's more likely to work for readers. So that's where it started. Yes. So in a Waterstones in Leith.
I have to admit that as I was reading it, I wondered how the booksellers in the 21st century would be dealing with, the problems of ebooks and how they would, get into those changes.
Well, if I keep writing the series, maybe I'll get there one day. It would be, I think, of course, for the Saint-Jacques, which is the name of the family, the clan, they have other sources of revenue than books as well. I suspect that might well be that in the modern era, their bookshops would still be going concerns, but would probably need much, much greater help from other, economic avenues. Though, of course, actually, the new bookshop, which sells old books and rarities, probably that would be fine, because at the very high end of the market, particularly with their stock as well, with their massive amounts of hidden stuff that they can bring out, which they're allowed to sell, as opposed to the stuff that must never, emerge from the secret sellers. I suspect they'd have quite a lot of extremely valuable stock they could bring out if necessary.
Yeah, I was going to say the antiquarian trade doesn't seem to be slowing down or losing money as far as I can tell. So, well,
I think it has changed quite a lot. I mean, I don't know if I just read Oliver Darkshire's new book, Once Upon a Tome.
It's on my list. It looks amazing.
It's great. Yeah, it's funny and it's clever, but it also, it's about rare book selling and and some of the changes there. And I guess the main one is that it's relatively easy to establish a value for something now. And so many of those old avenues of, Lifeline book fairs or whatever, they've had a look to see what they've got and whether it's valuable. You don't get that sort of treasure finding aspect so much anymore because people can look it up.
There are a couple of books that I've got on my list. Every time I go into a secondhand bookshop, I'm like, I wonder if I'll happen to find this that is impossible to find elsewhere, and they don't know. But I suspect that that's just a forlorn hope.
Yeah, but it's still a hope. It can still happen. You just never know. And also just garage sale, people can't be bothered. You just that sort of thing. You never can tell. Walking past, hard rubbish collection day, all the books are out. Got to look at them carefully.
Oh, always.
Yeah, for sure.
So if you've had sort of vague fantasy plans about opening a bookshop, and you obviously go to a lot of bookshops, you still think that there's a place for physical bookshops in the 21st century?
Absolutely. I mean, I think they are still important places, of discovery and community. And it's like, I think it has got harder. It was always a hard business. it's got even harder. But when it's done really well, you can create a truly wonderful place. But this sort of, I guess this applies to a lot of other things. You can't be an also ran kind of bookstore. I think it's just not going to last, unfortunately. But if it is a destination and you make it a place that people want to come to and there's things going on, I mean, it's an enormous amount of work. And of course, and if your objective is to make money, do something else. Or to make a lot of money is to do something else. But yeah, I mean, I love bookstores, and one of the things I miss about this COVID era is, when I go on tour and see lots and lots of different bookstores and be in lots of different bookstores and see books that I never knew existed. And that's one of the good things I love so much. I mean, I buy books online. I read ebooks as well as paper books. They're all important. They all have their place. I find books through lots of online ways, but it still doesn't match up with, just wandering around a bookstore and finding things you never knew existed. You suddenly want to read, and also just the whole environment of a good bookstore I like. And of course, I think they're a very important part of the environment for, promoting books and for helping authors connect to readers, for readers to meet each other quite often. I mean, it's interesting, signing queues at an author event, people meet friends, they meet lovers. I mean, it's all kinds of stuff happening in signing queues. There's probably a book to be written about, sort of meet cutes and signing queues. All of that stuff, just, it wouldn't happen if the bookstore wasn't there. And, and booksellers who will find things for you or will make connections you didn't know. I mean, where you mention a book that you love, and that is a clue for them to connect you to some other book, which you just wouldn't have heard of otherwise. But their expertise and their knowledge has made that happen for you. And maybe you find an author that you love all their work for the rest of your life and, read dozens of times, and you would not have encountered that author without that bookstore experience. So I do think they're important, but it's a hard business.
You mentioned good bookshops. Are there particular things that you think are important in the physical space for a bookshop?
I like a lot of stock, but that's hard too, of course, because, that's invested money. I love a really large, interesting bookshop that has a lot of books. I like them to be organised. I mean, I'm not a supremely organised. I don't organise my shelves, but I like bookshops to have. It's possibly very hypocritical, except I'm not trying to sell mine off my bookshelves. Yeah, and I think, where it's friendly and welcoming and the staff say hello and all that sort of thing. I mean, at Dalton's, going way back to Dalton's, we were trained and expected to say hello to everybody, to ask if they needed help, to leave them alone if they said no. All of those sorts of things, I think, are important. Just creating that welcoming environment where everyone's a book lover, or maybe they aren't. Maybe you should treat them as if they are. So all of those things, adequate light, which can be a bit tricky. Some books need to stay in the darkness. Rare books don't want too much light. Yeah, I guess probably, friendly booksellers with a lot of books is the very basic requirement. But I love bookstores that are quirky and reflect, the owners or the staff's interests. I love personal recommendations. I love bookstores that let their staff build a tower out of some book that they love and no one's ever heard of. Things like that, which is, goes against the sort of corporate dictate, you must have this book there and so on. Though I do understand the requirements for that sort of stuff. I think there's a sort of happy medium where you can have all the systems and processes which make it easy to sell books and find books and so on. But you still need that creative flair, and you've got to give your booksellers the freedom to make it more interesting as well on top of those good systems. Because, of course, the idiosyncratic bookshop that looks fascinating and got the quirky eccentrics, but they can never find a book for you is no good either. So I kind of like creative efficiency, I suppose, is something that I like. And I also like it if they have a great cafe. I mean, My friend and I's plan was always to have a bar as well as the bookshop. Again, better margins on alcohol. But also, this would be nice. It'd be, maybe have a ramen bar and a bookshop. But then there's practical complications with all of that kind of stuff as well. But all of them can be addressed. I like a bookshop that's open, very late. But again, expensive and difficult. The giant Barnes and Noble at Columbus Circle in New York, you'd go there at midnight. Back in the day, it's long gone, and it would be full of people, buying books, looking at magazines. I mean, all the magazines are mostly gone now too. But just that's sort of the life, the bookshop as a hub of life, I think is great. But yes, very hard to achieve, and harder now than ever, probably.
Yeah. I don't know if it's still there. There used to be a little bar called the Moat underneath the State Library of Victoria, which was primarily a bar, but they also had like the equivalent of one of those little libraries. So you could just go and pick a book, and like all their cocktails were like literary themes and those sorts of things.
Yeah. Well, the State Library here in Sydney has just opened a new bar on top of the State Library, which I've not been to, but my wife Anna has been to. So I mean, that's a good start. I don't know if the Moat is still there. I mean, I remember it from years ago, but I haven't been to the State Library of Victoria for a long time, sadly. So
yeah, I hope the Moat's still there. It was always a lot of fun.
Yeah, sadly, I suspect it might not be, but maybe it could come back.
It would be good.
Yeah.
Garth, my final question is hopefully an easy one, which is, what are you reading at the moment?
Well, I just read Once Upon a Tome, Oliver Darkshire. I've just finished that. And then I just read, I can't remember where I saw a reference to it. It's quite an odd book from the 1930s called Miss Hargraves by Frank Baker, which, it's very obscure. And it's about a young man and his friend who invent an old woman as a sort of joke. But then she turns out to be real, and she descends upon their town and makes his life a misery. But it's not ultimately completely satisfactory, but it's a fascinating fantasy about sort of creation, because essentially it's a sort of variation of one of those things where you're cursed with what you say will become real. And what he says about this old woman becomes real, and he gets himself sort of deeper into a hole as he invents stuff about her, initially for fun, but then to try and rectify the situation. So it sort of turns into a horror story towards the end. I wish I could remember. Something led me to it, which happens quite often. I'm reading something else, and then I'm sort of led into thinking, I've never heard of that book. I must now find it and read it. And sometimes that's one of the great things about ebooks. This was an ebook, though weirdly it was quite hard to find, because searching, it's part of it's been published as part of a series called the Bloomsbury Group. And if you search just the title, it doesn't show up. You have to search. I had to do a roundabout search. So ebooks that can be a weird treasure hunt. So I actually just finished reading that yesterday. It's an interesting book. I mean, it also has the poetry. At the back, it has the poetry of the invented old woman, which is quite strange. But one of the things I like about it the most is that the main character's father is aware of this creation thing that goes on, and he swore off it himself because of something that he did. He created a lizard in South America when he was a youth, and has sworn off it. And he just talks in such a weird, and his whole dialogue is a method of making sure nothing can come true. He just has such weird conversational methods. It's clever and it's funny, but I think it ultimately doesn't totally work. That's probably a classic example of my reading. The other thing that I've been reading or rereading for the first time in probably 40 plus years is Julian May and her Pliocene Exile books, which I only very vaguely remembered. And I saw some hardcovers at St. Vincent de Paul and bought them because weirdly they're not available, or maybe they are available now on ebooks. They weren't a few years ago. But anyway, I saw the hardcovers and bought them. So I've just reread that quartet
Did they hold up?
Mostly. Yeah, mostly, yes. They're still very gripping stories. There's a few oddities. There's some sort of strange stuff there, but yeah, they do. I mean, and I could see why they impressed me so much when I first read them at 15 or whatever, because they're powerful, clever stories. And also it's science fiction that is fantasy, really. It's the framing is all science fiction, but their meta psychic powers is all really fantasy.
Yeah.
And of course, they are also meant to be fantasy archetypes. Their existence laid the foundation for the later myths. So it's a very interesting combo. So it's been good to read them. I mean, I seriously, I don't think I've read them for at least 40 years. Yeah, so there's a St. Vincent de Paul just across from my office here, and I do look at their bookshelves quite often. I haven't ever seen any super rare books that are worth a fortune, but, a $5 hardcover, $20 for 4 hardcovers, that's not bad.
Very quickly, that turns into you having saved a fortune.
Well, and also I probably will give these back too. So it's really like it's a library fee. I tend to keep books, but I have 120 boxes in a storage unit. I have this office, which also has a storage room, which is actually mostly full of my own books, because even though I try and give them away and so on, all the different publishers send me quite a lot. The Americans in particular send me a lot, which is good, of course. And then I'm at home is completely full of books as well. So I do now try and think, yes, maybe I don't actually have to keep these. I will give them back to St. Vincent de Paul.
Garth, thank you very much for your time. This has been fantastic. I'll end it there.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Always happy to talk about books. It's easy, isn't it?
Thanks for listening to this out-of-schedule episode. If you enjoyed it, consider leaving a review or a rating somewhere. You can find Paper Defiance on Twitter as Paper Defiance Pod, on Instagram as Paper Defiance, and on Facebook it's Paper Defiance Podcast. This podcast is created and produced by me, Alexandra Pearce. The music is called Loopster by Kevin MacLeod, and you can find the attribution at paperdefiance.com.